Hi, Carla 2020. I'm Dr. Courtney Brannon Donoghue. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Media Arts at the University of North Texas in the United States. And for those of y'all interested in Texas geography, I know there's so many of you, we're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I often describe myself as a global media industry scholar because I'm really interested in the certain global dynamics that are reshaping the media business today. So I focus a lot on contemporary production and distribution cultures. And what that means is I talk to people in the industry. Most of my research is grounded in industry interviews. I spend a lot of time talking to below the line, above the line, executives at various levels, people who work in policy and film festivals. And so I spend a lot of time doing international field work, kind of gathering these stories and trying to understand these dynamics through on-the-ground conversations. So for this collection, Women in the International Film Industry, my chapter comes from a current book project I'm working on. And so I'm really interested right now in my research how women's work is valued, or oftentimes devalued, in the film industry, and what barriers female-led projects, also known in Hollywood as female-driven, so anything that's directed, written, and or produced by a woman, and very often has women are in front of the camera as well. How these types of projects face certain challenges at each stage of filmmaking. And so I'm looking at various sectors. I'm looking at development and financing, production, film festivals, distribution and marketing phases. And this research really emerged from my first book, which was called Localizing Hollywood. It was published by the British Film Institute Press a couple of years ago. And in this book, I examined Hollywood studios' international operations in Europe and Latin America from the 1990s to 2010s. And so when I was interviewing various managing directors, so the people who run the Fox office, Sony, Warner Brothers in Germany, Spain, or Brazil, for example. I interviewed people in all those countries. I could count on one hand how many women were in positions of power in these offices. And so I talked to dozens of people in many offices, and I was just completely astounded by this. And so this little question kept nagging at me as I was thinking about another future research, another project. And so it basically started as me asking, where are all the women working in Hollywood, and how do they navigate a male-dominated industry? And so since 2016, I've been interviewing producers, writers, directors, executives, film programmers, policymakers, so people in various roles, and mostly women. And what I did not anticipate would be, in the middle of all these interviews, this transformative moment, these movements coming with Me Too and Time's Up, and the conversations about gender inequity and sexism in the media industries and how rapidly they would be changing. And many days I feel like I'm chasing a moving target. So the chapter is part of this collection. The title is Hollywood and Gender Equity Debates in the Me Too Time's Up Era. It's pretty descriptive. I was organizing it around kind of two perspectives or approaches. I was interested in kind of giving an overview of the historical context of the Hollywood studio system in the 20th century and women's place in it. And then I was also interested in trying to outline this kind of complicated series of events between 2015 and 2017 that kind of appear as pressure points in this fight towards gender parity. So my research is still really evolving, and so this chapter was really helpful in that. And I'm going to today talk a little bit about three broad takeaways that I think can be addressed either to emerging and established female filmmakers, but also to industry gatekeepers. So the first takeaway is, to understand what's happening now, we have to understand where we came from. And particularly in terms of the historical context of Hollywood institutions and business cultures, show a long history of marginalizing and excluding women in the film industry, particularly in prized positions of power, prestigious positions. So look at any decade for a history of gendered work, glass ceilings, and more recently kind of discussions about glass cliffs, which is where a woman executive is hired to fix whatever failing company her male predecessor has left. Women working in the classical Hollywood studio system, they were there, but most of them worked in invisible, low-paid, low-respect, in administrative cleric roles, what Erin Hill calls women's work. So they were there, but they were not visible, and they weren't valued in the same way as certain other prized positions. So for every Ida Lupino, Anita Loos, Virginia Van Up, these were the exceptions, right? There were a lot of women who were not that successful in navigating the system. So another takeaway is an individual alone cannot topple structural disparities. One of the things I've really been kind of struggling with and wanting to outline in my research is this kind of tension between the individual and the structural. How these systemic issues cannot be toppled by one person's effort alone. So the kind of, quote, lean in lie of post-feminism that many women I interviewed internalized was, you must change yourself to fit into the system. And that's worked. I mean, I guess it's worked for some women, some exceptions, navigating the system to fit yourself into it. Of course, women must take an active role in their career trajectories and in ambition and gaining experience and networking, but they can't carry this burden alone, particularly in a system that for over 100 years that we arrive today in the film industry, it's a male-dominated system that was not built for or by these women. And so institutional cultures and business practices that devalue women's voices and contributions must be dramatically overhauled. This needs to start in university programs like my own, and not stop until we reach the highest studio C-suite. So long-term sustainable measures are needed at every stage. Focus should not only be on short-term wins of employment, which are really important, but that's just the start. What about the other industry gates, doors, tables that we need to get women access to? So one example would be 50-50 by 2020. I've been really interested in this transnational movement that's targeted international film festivals and how they program their lineups. Where are there other centers of power? How can we disrupt them? So thinking not just beyond kind of traditional employment or traditional putting women in director seats, which we absolutely need to do. Thinking about all these different sectors and phases, like what 50-50 by 2020 is doing with the pressure they're putting on film festivals around the world. But also, how can we balance short-term gains while also investing in long-term wins? And that's really, how do we make these changes sustainable? And so finally, my third takeaway is visibility is a start, but it's not an end. Early in Me Too and Time's Up movements, two strategies were used to create pressure points, gain attention by those in power, particularly in Hollywood, and really shed light, kind of accelerate the popular debate around gender equity in the film industry or the media industries at large. So the practice of data shaming. Data shaming is when quantitative studies highlight inequitable employment numbers and by putting significant pressure on certain traditional institutions through press and social media attention. Most widely circulated statistics from a few years back include the 4% of top grossing Hollywood movies were directed by women. So that got circulated quite a bit and got a lot of attention. So that data point is so depressing, right? Where there have been some improvements, we still have a long way to go. But this particular data point led to the 4% challenge, which was announced at Sundance, was really in 2019 and was kind of the social media movement to challenge major studios in Hollywood to hire one female director in the next 18 months. But with only a few signing on, it's still too soon to really see the long-term impact of this. But it's things like this that where visibility and pressure kind of intersect. Another example would be a lot of the red carpet activism that was happening towards the beginning of Me Too and Time's Up, where A-list talent would wear black, or they use awards acceptance speeches as a platform to call attention to the lack of women, specifically lack of women of color in positions of power. And this is both in front and behind the camera. So example that was widely cited and got a lot of press attention was Frances McDormand's speech at the 2018 Oscars, where she mentions and shouts out inclusion writers. So writers are a clause built into a contract, and so it's like a legal agreement, where high-profile talent can require more inclusive hiring on a project. So while A-list talent and decision makers absolutely should leverage their power for this fight, and we're seeing more and more people that recently, Ryan Reynolds has announced an initiative of his own, it still shifts the burden of structural change onto the individual, which are often, way too often, women and people of color to fix these structural disparities. So these strategies have been really important steps early on in this fight, but this fight has just begun. As Sarah Benet Weiser said, quote, "Simply becoming visible does not usher in sweeping change. Visibility is at best a tool for social change, but not an end," end quote. So I end my presentation with this. Once you have the attention, what can you do with it? And what can you do with it sustainably? What can you do with it holistically? What can you do with it across the industry? What other tools do you have in your toolbox for smashing the patriarchy in Hollywood? Thank you.